Welcome Internet to Psychoanalytic Talk, and today we're going to be talking about a very interesting concept which I think doesn't get enough of the spotlight, and that you can find in Otto Kernberg's very good book, Aggression in Personality Disorders and Perversions. So this concept I'm talking about is peak affect state. So what is it? Peak affect state is an idea that describes the intense and very, very profound emotions and feelings and experiences of the baby in his mental life. So those experiences are very, very intense, but can be very good, very pleasurable, and very displeasurable or even painful. So Otto Kernberg explains that at that point in life, those affects are incredibly strong. They're not yet emotions, they're not yet cognitively understood by the baby. There's no real framework for the baby to put them in. But, and this is a very important point, they're going to be of such intensity that they're going to leave an impact on the psyche of the baby. So fundamentally, what is happening? So those affects are high in intensity. For example, you can think about breastfeeding for the good ones, and physical pain or discomfort for the bad ones. And what it's going to say is that because of the high level of intensity, they're categorized in two explicit groups, the all good and the all bad. There is no such thing as mild affect states, right? Peak affect states. And those, as the name indicates, peak means it's really at the real top. And fundamentally, he says that these affects, those peak affects, are going to be fundamental in the merging of the drives and the object relations. So here it goes with the whole framework of Kernberg that you cannot get away off the drives. The drives are fundamental, and he explains it with this idea of peak affect, that the drives are incredibly strong and pull in an immense way and with an immense force. And for him, those experiences of peak affects are exactly what the mind needs to integrate the object, because they're so incredibly strong that in a way they pull the object to them in a way that could not happen if the peak affects were far less extreme. And he says that that extremeness creates the object relationship. And that's very, very interesting, because it would imply that without it, the individual would only be drive-based, which even by his own definition is impossible, but theoretically that's what it implies, which is very interesting as an implication. So what is going to be the destiny of those peak affects? Well, those peak affects are not themselves going to last. What's going to happen is that through, of course, acts of care, acts of symbolization with the child, acts of love, acts of protection, acts of limitations, the child is going to be able to cope with those peak affects. And those peak affects are slowly going to lose a form of force. The drives are going to start going into the unconscious mind as the ego is created, because that's also what is happening, is that as ego creation is occurring, the peak affects are losing their strength and getting inside of the unconscious, being pushed back into the unconscious mind, the id, to use Freud's vocabulary. So as the ego emerges, the peak affects are slowly dying down. What happens is there's a moderate affect, meaning that it's something that still has a force, but it's not as strong. However, this is where it's going to be very interesting. Those peak affects are not going to completely fade away. They're going to stay, and they're going to be the trigger of fantasy. Because for Kernberg, what is happening is that those peak affects are the fundamental core base of fantasy. Like, for example, when you have a daydream or when you have a sexual desire, that's a direct heritage of the peak affects, because since they're so extreme, even in sexuality and daydreaming can be very extreme, are basically a remnant of it. And fundamentally, it's the starting point of the whole of the mental framework. And I found that to be very interesting, as fundamentally it gives us a starting point for fantasy. The starting point of fantasy is the experience we feel of high intensity. And what he says is that fundamentally with adults, when people are adults, when they experience something very, very intense, what is happening is that those peak affects that were lived as infants are coming forward once again, are in a way being reborn at the moment of high intensity. And as such, in that rebirth, it's splits. It's a mechanism that happens is that fundamentally that saying good and bad is going to happen. It's wonderful or it's complete trash. And that's pretty much how it even occurs within adults. And it's very interesting because at least he doesn't say that in the book, but that's how I see it, is that once you are in that state, there is no more fantasy. What is happening is that you're projecting, throwing something out of yourself, or you're completely denying reality. So it seems that he has hit the nail on the head when he presents this theory, because fundamentally, peak affects are all good, or all bad. A bit like splitting, projection, and denial. There is no middle ground. And fundamentally, fantasy is also a form of middle ground, as it's a way of, I can say, playing around with the ideas, with the feelings, with the experience, rather than acting it out. So very, very interesting stuff indeed. And the peak affect allows us to understand that there is a starting point in the psyche and in its development, because for him it's also a form of power and strength. And that's what he says, is that fundamentally, when you're using object relation theory, you tend to undermine, or at least non-consider aggression. And he says that the peak affects are also in an aggressive way trying to integrate everything. So in a way, the peak affects are the fundamental core motivators of the id. And he says, and I found that very interesting because it explains why we are motivated. We are motivated because inside our core of our psyche, there are still forces, peak affects, that are still there and push us to do stuff. And that pushing us to do stuff, be it making a video on YouTube, for example, or reading a book, playing a video game, having a sexual relationship, and so on and so forth, are, in a way, distant relatives of the peak affects. And it's the peak affects still manifesting themselves. So very interesting. So it's, first and foremost, an experience, a lived experience that then becomes contained by the love, care, limitations also, and protection of the parent towards the child, meaning that it becomes less intense, moral affects, but the peak still stays at the core. And it also forces the ego to organize present, past, and future. So why does it force the ego to organize it? Because in a way, because it's so powerful, pleasurable and displeasurable, the ego is going to try and gain or re-trigger the pleasurable events and trying to minimize the displeasurable events. And if you've read any of Freud, you know where this is going. This is going about pleasure principle and how it works, like avoiding pain, maximizing pleasure. But the ego, to do that, is going to try its hardest to create a temporal framework in which the id is no longer part of, because the id doesn't accept time itself. It denies time, at least according to Freud and by extension Kernberg. But the ego is time-based, and it's doing that because it understands that the peak affects and the pleasure, or the pain, let's not forget the pain, both of those sins can repeat themselves in time, and therefore there's a way of gaming the system, so to speak, and trying to maximize pleasure and avoid displeasure. So it's very interesting stuff. And we have here, in the idea of peak affects, in a way, the understanding in the mind is birthed through experience, and not just like thinking, but real core feelings and complete impact and effects. And second of all, we have the fact that it's so strong that it creates the relationship with others, because fundamentally you let them into your world because of the peak effects, and fundamentally it creates an opening for object relationships. Very, very interesting. So we have the dawn of human experience, the dawn of object fairies, and the dawn of fantasy, which is broad here to say everything from daydreaming to sexual projections or sexual constructs in the mind. So fundamentally, it's a very important framework underlined by the idea of it creates motivation itself within the ego to do stuff. That everything we do is in a way recreate peak affects to try and do something of them, to try and use them to gain a pleasurable state. So it's a very, very interesting way of merging many, many ideas that are extremely classical, but still work quite well. And I feel that Kernberg gives us an opportunity to think about this not as split, like or your object fairy or your drive fairy, and there's no communication, but it's something unified. In a way, it's something that's very, I feel, good, because too often we tend to break and split everything off into sections, currents, schools of thought. But reality, I think, is much more general than that, and that many fairies can be true at the same time, or even better, many fairies can merge and give something more creative. And that's what it feels like. Peak affect states feels like the merging, the good merging of two fundamental core ideas, object relation theory and the drive theory of Freud. So fundamentally a very interesting concept, and one that I thoroughly recommended, that even psychologically I tend to use to try and explain the dawn of consciousness and the mind itself. So fundamentally that pretty much sums it up. If you want to leave a comment below, please feel free to do so, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.